It had been nearly a decade since I'd last seen Ethan. We grew up together, practically inseparable through our teenage years. While I took the traditional route, college, a steady career, and eventually marriage, Ethan had always been the dreamer. He went off to chase his artistic passions in New York while I settled down in the suburbs with my wife, Sarah. We stayed in touch sporadically, the occasional text or holiday card, but life had its way of pulling us in different directions. When he called out of the blue, it was like no time had passed. "Man, we need to catch up," he'd said, his voice buzzing with the same infectious energy I remembered from our youth. He suggested meeting in a city halfway between where we lived. I didn't think twice about agreeing. It felt like the right time to reconnect with an old friend, to revisit the memories of simpler days. As luck would have it, Sarah had a business trip scheduled for the same city that weekend. I remember texting her, thinking it was a happy coincidence. She didn't seem too excited about the trip, though. Work had been demanding for her lately, and I figured she was just tired. Still, a strange feeling gnawed at me. I chalked it up to stress. We'd both been working hard, and I had been preoccupied with my job more than I liked to admit. The day came, and I headed to the hotel where Ethan and I planned to meet. It was a swanky place, more upscale than I'd expect Ethan to pick, but I figured his success as an artist might have afforded him such luxuries. As I walked into the lobby, the first person I noticed wasn't Ethan, it was Sarah. She was sitting at the hotel bar, dressed to the nines, laughing with someone. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until I got closer that I saw who she was talking to Ethan. My best friend, the guy I hadn't seen in years, sitting at a bar with my wife. Both of them laughing like they'd known each other forever. A small, uneasy feeling stirred in my gut. "Hey, there he is!" Ethan's voice broke through the momentary fog in my head. He stood up to greet me with the same carefree smile I remembered from our youth. Sarah turned and smiled too, though there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite place. "Small world, huh?" she said, almost too casually, as if it were no big deal that she was having drinks with my childhood friend. "Yeah, I guess so," I replied, trying to shake off the odd feeling and play it cool. We all sat together, and Ethan dove into stories about his life in New York, his art projects, and how he had been looking for inspiration for his next big piece. Sarah, to my surprise, seemed completely enthralled by the conversation. She had never shown much interest in art before, but now she was asking questions, engaging with him in a way that caught me off guard. I tried to enjoy the evening, telling myself it was just the excitement of seeing an old friend. But that nagging feeling, the one I'd pushed down, kept creeping back. The way Sarah laughed at his jokes, the way her eyes lit up when they talked about his work. Something wasn't right. Still, I told myself I was overreacting. After all, they had only just met, hadn't they? The next day, as I was getting ready to meet Ethan again, that uneasy feeling from the night before still lingered. Maybe I was being paranoid, reading too much into things. After all, Sarah and Ethan had just met. But still, I couldn't quite shake the image of them at the bar, sharing that easy laughter like old friends. When I arrived at the hotel, I saw Ethan right away, lounging in one of those oversized leather chairs in the lobby, scrolling through his phone. But Sarah wasn't anywhere in sight. It felt like a relief, but only for a moment. I tried not to overthink it as I walked over to greet him. "Hey man," Ethan stood up with a big grin. He looked just like the Ethan I remembered, relaxed with that same carefree air about him, but there was something different in his demeanor, something more polished, like life had refined the edges I used to know. "Ready to grab some lunch?" We headed out to a nearby bistro, talking about our lives over the past 10 years. Ethan filled me in on his art career, how he'd started small, doing street shows and galleries, but then hit it big with a series of portraits that caught the eye of some well-connected patrons. Now, he was practically a rising star in the art world, mingling with celebrities and collectors. It felt good to catch up, to hear about his success. But as much as I tried to focus on the conversation, there was a nagging question I couldn't keep to myself any longer. "So, how'd you and Sarah end up at the bar last night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Ethan smiled, a little sheepishly. "Oh man, that was pure coincidence. I was waiting for you and spotted her at the bar. We started talking, and when she mentioned she was married to you, I was like, what are the odds? It sounded harmless enough. Still, I found it strange that they'd hit it off so quickly. Sarah wasn't usually the type to open up to strangers, especially someone like Ethan, who had always been so different from the kind of people she usually connected with. I nodded, trying to let it go. Yeah, small world, huh? Ethan changed the subject, asking about my job and life in the suburbs. I told him about my work, the grind of corporate life, and how Sarah and I had been talking about starting a family soon. But the more we talked, the more I realized how different our lives had become. Ethan's world was full of art, creativity, and spontaneity, while mine was rooted in routine and stability. After lunch, Ethan mentioned that he had to head back to his hotel to work on some sketches for an upcoming project. He invited me to join him at his studio later that evening for a drink, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Part of me felt like I should reconnect with my old friend, but another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, didn't want to be around him and Sarah again. Not after last night. Maybe, I said, hedging. I'll see how the day goes. We parted ways, and I wandered back to the hotel, my thoughts swirling. As I walked into the lobby, I checked my phone. No messages from Sarah. I figured she was still at her conference, so I headed up to our room. When I walked in, though, I was met with an unexpected sight. Sarah was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in her hand, looking a little startled to see me. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. "I thought you were with Ethan." I replied, trying to read her expression. "I just came back to relax for a bit." She nodded, a little too quickly, before turning back to her phone. Something about the whole situation felt off. We'd been married for 7 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, I knew when something was bothering her. And right now, there was definitely something. "How was the conference?" I asked, hoping to make conversation. "Good," she said, without looking up. "Just a lot of the usual stuff." I sat down beside her, watching as she scrolled through her phone, her face unreadable. I wanted to ask more, to push for answers about what was really going on, but I held back. Maybe I was just overthinking it, letting my insecurities get the best of me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah went back to her conference, and I wandered the city, trying to shake off the gnawing doubts. It was irrational, I told myself. Ethan was my friend, Sarah was my wife. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of unease that had taken hold since that night at the bar. That evening, I reluctantly decided to join Ethan at his studio. Maybe seeing him in his element, immersed in his work, would remind me that I had nothing to worry about. After all, this was the same guy who'd been like a brother to me growing up. I couldn't let some irrational jealousy ruin our reunion. The studio was located in an industrial part of the city, all exposed brick and high ceilings. A perfect space for an artist like Ethan. When I walked in, he was already at work, his hands moving across a canvas with practiced ease. The place smelled like paint and turpentine, and the floor was littered with sketches and half-finished pieces. "Hey man," Ethan called out when he saw me. "Glad you could make it." I nodded, trying to relax. "Yeah, figured I'd check out your workspace." He grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're just in time. I was about to start on something new." I wandered around, glancing at the various works in progress scattered around the studio. Some were abstract, others more traditional portraits, but all of them had a certain intensity that was unmistakably Ethan. "So, what's the new project?" I asked, stopping in front of a large canvas draped in a sheet. Ethan's eyes lit up, and he motioned for me to come closer. "I'm working on a series," he said, pulling the sheet away to reveal a stunning charcoal sketch of a woman. I stared at the figure, recognizing the delicate lines and curves instantly. It was Sarah. My stomach twisted, though I tried to play it cool. "That's Sarah?" Ethan nodded, clearly excited. "Yeah, I've been looking for the right muse for this series, and when I saw her the other night, it just clicked. She's perfect for what I have in mind." There was again that word, muse. It felt too intimate, too personal. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. "Does she know about this?" I asked, my voice a little strained. "Of course," Ethan said, not picking up on my discomfort. "She was flattered, actually. We talked about it the other night after you left. I asked if she'd be interested in modeling for a few sketches, and she seemed really into the idea." I forced a smile. That's great. But inside, I felt like I was being hollowed out. I couldn't help but wonder why Sarah hadn't mentioned it to me. Why would she agree to something like this without even talking to me first? Ethan moved to another canvas, oblivious to the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I've got some big ideas for this series, he said, his voice full of excitement. It's going to be intimate, but not in a sexual way. More like capturing her essence, you know? There's something about her. It's hard to explain, but I feel like I can really bring out something raw and real with her as my subject. The way he talked about Sarah, about my wife, made my skin crawl. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just Ethan being Ethan, passionate about his art. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like something else. Before I could respond, the door to the studio opened, and Sarah walked in. I turned, my heart sinking as I saw the look on her face. Excited, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She walked over to Ethan, barely acknowledging me at first. "Hey," she said, smiling at him before glancing at me. "I didn't know you'd be here. I just came to check out the place," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Ethan stepped back, giving Sarah room to look at the sketch he'd done of her. "What do you think?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with pride. Sarah studied the drawing, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I can't believe that's me." I watched them from the sidelines, feeling like an outsider in a conversation that should have been between me and her. The connection between them was undeniable. Maybe it was just the artist-muse relationship Ethan kept talking about, but to me, it felt like more. It felt like a line was being crossed, even if neither of them realized it. "I'm thinking we could do a few more sessions," Ethan continued, still oblivious to the tension I was feeling. "You up for it?" Sarah nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I'd love that." It was all I could do to keep my emotions in check. How had this happened? How had my wife, my Sarah, gotten so wrapped up in Ethan's world without me even realizing it? "Great," Ethan said, turning to me with a grin. "You don't mind, right? I mean, it's just art." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing a smile that felt like a lie. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't mind." But the truth was I minded more than I could admit. The days that followed felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold, not my own. Sarah seemed distant, but at the same time, she was more energized than I'd seen in months, maybe even years. She was constantly texting, her phone lighting up with notifications from Ethan about his art project. And every time I saw that smile creep across her face as she read his messages, my stomach churned. I tried to convince myself it was innocent. It had to be innocent. Sarah and Ethan were just working together on something creative. Maybe it was good for her to have something new, something outside of the routine that had defined our marriage for so long. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. One evening, just as I was about to settle down after a long day at work, the doorbell rang. It was Ethan. I hadn't expected him to show up at the house, but there he was, standing on my doorstep like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Hey man," he said, giving me that easy smile. "Mind if I come in for a sec?" I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, letting him in. We made small talk for a few minutes, mostly about his latest projects and what he had planned for the future. I tried to stay engaged, but my mind was elsewhere, specifically on what Sarah and Ethan were really doing during their art sessions. After a few awkward pauses, Ethan finally got to the point. "So, I've been thinking," he said, leaning forward slightly, "about the series with Sarah. It's really coming together, but I think it could go further. I'd like to make her the centerpiece of the whole project." I blinked, not sure how to respond. "The centerpiece?" "Yeah," Ethan said, nodding enthusiastically. "She's got this natural grace, this presence that really stands out. I think if we explore it more deeply, it could turn into something incredible. I'm talking about more than just sketches or simple portraits. I want to create a series that captures her essence, her vulnerability, her strength." His words felt like a punch to the gut. My wife, my Sarah, was going to be at the center of this project, bearing her soul for Ethan's art. I clenched my fists, trying to keep calm. "What exactly do you mean by explore it more deeply?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. Ethan didn't seem to notice. "I want to do some more intimate pieces," he explained. Not just physical nudity, but emotional nudity, if that makes sense. I want to capture her in ways that are raw, real, and personal. I could feel the tension in my chest building. The words were swimming around in my head. Intimate, personal, vulnerable. Ethan was talking about my wife, as if she were some kind of muse, a figure to be shaped and molded for his artistic vision. It didn't sit right with me. Have you talked to Sarah about this? I asked, my tone a little harder now. Ethan hesitated for the first time. Not in detail, no, he admitted. But I know she's interested. She's really connected to the idea of being a part of something bigger, something meaningful. Something meaningful, I repeated, feeling the anger simmering just beneath the surface. I wanted to lash out, to tell him to back off, but I knew that would only make things worse. Instead, I forced a tight smile and nodded. Well, I'll talk to her about it. Ethan didn't seem to pick up on the tension in my voice. Great, he said, standing up and patting me on the back. I'm really excited about this. I think it's going to be incredible. As soon as he left, I sat there in silence, my thoughts racing. What the hell was happening? How had we gone from a casual catch-up with an old friend to my wife becoming the focal point of his latest art project? And why hadn't she mentioned any of this to me? That night, I waited for Sarah to come home. When she finally walked through the door, looking tired but still buzzing with the same strange energy she'd had since Ethan came back into our lives, I knew I had to bring it up. We need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked at me, surprised by my serious tone. What's going on? Ethan came by, I started. He told me about his project, about how he wants you to be the centerpiece of it. He said it's going to be intimate. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't seem upset. If anything, she looked intrigued. Yeah, we've talked about it a little. I think it's a great opportunity. I stared at her, trying to understand what was going through her mind. You really want to do this? I asked, my voice strained. You want to let Ethan, put you at the center of something so personal? She sighed and sat down on the couch, running a hand through her hair. It's not like that. It's not about him. It's about the art. It's about me too. I've spent so long being safe, being careful, and I feel like I've lost part of who I am. This is a chance to reconnect with something I've been missing. I shook my head, not sure I was hearing her right. So, you're saying you've been missing something? Something I can't give you? Sarah didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. It's not about you. It's just, I've been feeling like I need more than this. She gestured vaguely to the house, to our life. I love you, but I need something for me, something that makes me feel alive. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I had always thought we were solid, that our marriage, while not perfect, was still strong. But now, listening to her talk about feeling alive, I realized that something had been slipping away for a long time, and I hadn't even noticed. So, what are you saying? I asked, my voice hollow. You want this thing with Ethan to make you feel alive again? Sarah looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw a flash of guilt in her eyes. It's not about Ethan, she repeated softly. It's about me. The days after our conversation felt like I was walking through a fog. Sarah had made her position clear. This art project with Ethan was something she needed, something she was pursuing for herself. But every time I tried to wrap my head around it, all I could feel was the distance growing between us, like a chasm that had opened up overnight. The thing was, I couldn't pinpoint the moment when we started drifting apart. Maybe it had been gradual, so subtle that I didn't notice until it was too late. We used to be close, shared dreams, shared laughter. But now it felt like we were living in parallel lives, just brushing up against each other occasionally, but never really connecting. Sarah threw herself into Ethan's world with a kind of passion I hadn't seen in years. She was spending more and more time at his studio, working late nights and even weekends. It wasn't long before I'd hear her slip out of bed in the early mornings, saying she needed to meet him for a session before work. I tried to stay supportive, telling myself it was just art, but the doubt gnawed at me. At first, I tried to busy myself with work, with the things that had always kept me grounded. But even that wasn't enough to drown out the feeling that something was slipping away. I noticed little things. How Sarah would come home late and shower immediately, or how she'd glance at her phone and smile. only to quickly put it away when I walked into the room. It wasn't long before I felt like a stranger in my own home. The moments we used to share, eating dinner together, watching a show, or just talking, became fewer and fewer. When I'd ask how her day had been, she'd respond with something vague like, just another day at the studio, before retreating into herself, her mind clearly somewhere else. And I knew exactly where. One Friday evening, Sarah came home glowing. I couldn't ignore the way she seemed more alive, more energized, like she'd found something in Ethan's world that I couldn't offer her anymore. It stung, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I poured myself a drink and tried to make conversation. "So, how's the project going?" I asked, careful to keep my tone light, even though the question felt heavy. Her face lit up. "It's going amazing. Ethan's really pushing me to dig deeper, to explore parts of myself I didn't even know were there." She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know it's a lot, but this is something I really need right now." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink to avoid saying something I might regret. "Right," I muttered, trying to sound supportive even though the bitterness was rising in my throat. "I'm glad it's going well." She sat down across from me, running her fingers through her hair, still buzzing from whatever had happened at the studio that day. "You should come by sometime," she said suddenly. "Ethan's been asking about you. He said he misses hanging out like we used to." The last thing I wanted was to spend more time watching Ethan and Sarah share something that I was no longer a part of. But I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, maybe I'll stop by." We both knew I wouldn't. The truth was, I was starting to resent the way she talked about him. The way her face would light up when she mentioned something Ethan had said or done. It was like she'd found a version of herself that didn't include me, a version that was thriving in a world I had no access to. I tried to brush it off, but every late-night text she got from Ethan, every excuse to spend time at his studio, felt like another wedge driving us further apart. The intimacy between us had faded to the point where even physical closeness felt forced. When we were in the same room, it was like we were both pretending things were fine, that we weren't unraveling. One weekend, Sarah left early again to meet Ethan for another session, leaving me alone in the house. I walked around the empty rooms, the silence pressing in on me. The walls felt too close, and the air too still. It was like our home had become just another reminder of what we'd lost. I decided to call up a few friends and meet for drinks, anything to get out of the house and away from the suffocating feeling that had settled over me. We met up at a local bar, the kind of place I used to love before life got so complicated. But even as I sat there, laughing with my friends, I couldn't shake the nagging thought of where Sarah was, what she was doing, and who she was doing it with. "How's Sarah?" one of my friends asked casually, not knowing the weight of the question. "Good," I replied automatically, though it felt like a lie. "Busy with work and art stuff." They nodded, moving on to talk about other things, but the pit in my stomach only deepened. As the night wore on, the drinks didn't help to numb the growing ache inside me. All I could think about was Sarah, how far she'd drifted, how much she'd changed, and how powerless I felt to stop it. When I got home that night, Sarah was already in bed, her phone clutched in her hand. I watched her for a moment, her face peaceful in sleep, but I couldn't bring myself to crawl in beside her. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at nothing, wondering how the woman I loved could feel so close, yet so impossibly far away. It was late one evening when Sarah came home from yet another session with Ethan. She walked into the house quietly, thinking I was already asleep, but I'd been sitting in the dark living room for over an hour, waiting for her. I watched as she slipped off her shoes by the door and moved silently toward the kitchen, her face glowing with the same energy that had become so familiar in recent weeks. I knew I should have gone to bed, avoided the confrontation, but I couldn't. "Not this time. Late night again?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. Sarah flinched, startled by my presence. She turned to face me, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the room. "Yeah," she replied softly, setting her bag down on the counter. "We lost track of time." "Lost track of time," I repeated, the words heavy with unspoken accusation. The tension in the room was palpable, like we were both teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. Sarah walked over and sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction I wanted to hear. "I know I've been spending a lot of time with Ethan, but it's been so important for me. It's like I'm rediscovering myself." I studied her face, trying to find some trace of the woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved for so long. But all I could see was someone I didn't recognize, someone who had drifted so far from me that I wasn't sure we'd ever be the same again. "And what about us?" I asked, my voice low. "Do we still matter in all of this? Because right now, it feels like I'm not even part of your life anymore." Sarah looked down at her hands, her silence telling me everything I needed to know. I felt a knot tighten in my chest as I leaned forward, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look," I began, "I get that this art thing is important to you. I get that you're trying to find something that's been missing, but I feel like I'm losing you. Every time you're with Ethan, it's like you're further away from me. I don't even know how to reach you anymore." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sighed, rubbing her forehead like she was trying to sort through her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost resigned. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's not about you. It's about me. I've been feeling so disconnected from everything. And being with Ethan, working on this project, it's helped me feel alive again." Her words stung, but I tried to push past the hurt. "So what? You need Ethan to feel alive?" "No," she said quickly, looking up at me. "It's not like that. It's just with him, I don't feel the pressure of expectations. He lets me be whoever I want to be." I clenched my jaw, my frustration boiling over. "What does that even mean? Do you think I'm the one putting pressure on you? I've always supported you, Sarah. I've been here, waiting, while you've been spending all your time with him. Do you even realize how that feels?" Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but before she could speak, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, and though she didn't pick it up, I knew exactly who it was. "That him?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. She hesitated, then nodded. "He was just checking in, making sure I got home safe." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands balled into fists, and I stood up, pacing the room as anger surged through me. "Are you serious? Sarah, I'm your husband. I'm the one who should be checking in, not him." She stood up too, crossing her arms defensively. "It's not what you think. Ethan and I are just friends. I'm doing this for the art, for myself." "For yourself?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You spent more time with him in the last few weeks than you have with me in months. How am I supposed to feel? You think I'm just going to sit back and watch while you drift away from me?" Her face softened for a moment, and I hoped, she was going to apologize, that maybe we could find a way back from this. But instead, she shook her head. "I can't apologize for doing something that makes me happy," she said quietly. I stared at her, feeling the weight of her words sink in. She was choosing him, over me. Whether she admitted it or not, that's what it came down to. "So, where does this leave us?" I asked, my voice cracking with the strain of holding back the pain. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't place. Guilt? Sadness? Whatever it was, it didn't feel like love. "I don't know," she whispered. We stood there in silence, the air between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to fight for her, to make her see that we could fix this, but I wasn't sure she wanted to be saved. Not anymore. That night, I slept on the couch. I told myself it was just because I was too angry to share a bed with her, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was because I couldn't bear the thought of being so close to her, knowing that in every way that mattered, she wasn't mine anymore. The next morning, Sarah left early for another session with Ethan. She didn't kiss me goodbye. She didn't even say a word as she slipped out the door. And as I lay there on the couch, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It was real, tangible, and it was growing every day. The growing tension between Sarah and me became unbearable. Every time she left for another session with Ethan, I felt like a part of her was slipping further away, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the truth gnawed at me. I could no longer convince myself that this was just about art. The night I'd finally had enough was colder than usual, the chill in the air mirroring the atmosphere in our home. Sarah had been gone longer than usual, and as I sat alone in the living room, nursing a drink, the same poisonous thoughts kept swirling in my head. What was really happening between them? Was it just artistic admiration, or was there something more, something I had been too blind or too trusting to see? I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my coat and keys and headed out the door, determined to confront the situation head-on. Ethan's studio wasn't far, and I knew exactly where it was. I had only been there once, but I remembered the route like it had been burned into my mind. By the time I arrived, my heart was pounding, a mix of anger, anxiety, and something darker that I couldn't quite name. I parked around the corner, out of sight, and stood outside the building for a long moment, gathering my thoughts. What was I going to say? What if I was wrong, and this was all just in my head? But what if I wasn't? I entered the building quietly, my footsteps echoing against the cold, industrial floors. The door to Ethan's studio was slightly ajar, and I could hear their voices inside, soft and indistinct at first. I moved closer, careful not to make a sound, until their words became clearer. "You're incredible. You know that?" Ethan's voice came through, smooth and full of admiration. "I've never worked with someone who understands my vision like you do." Sarah's soft laugh followed, but it wasn't the laugh I knew. It was lighter, almost flirtatious. "You're the one who brings it out in me. I don't know what it is, but when I'm here, I feel free." My blood ran cold. I knew I should have barged in right then and there, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I had to hear more, as much as it pained me. "I'm glad you feel that way," Ethan continued, his voice lowering. "We make a great team, don't we?" "Yeah," Sarah said, her voice soft and intimate. "I haven't felt like this in a long time." Something inside me snapped. Before I knew it, I was pushing the door open, my heart racing, my fists clenched at my sides. Sarah and Ethan both turned, startled by my sudden entrance. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice louder than I'd intended. Ethan stepped back, looking caught off guard but trying to maintain his composure. "Hey man, it's not what you think." I cut him off, my eyes locked on Sarah, who had gone pale, her mouth slightly open in shock. "Isn't it?" I shot back, my voice trembling with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. "Because it sure as hell sounds like it." Sarah stood there, frozen, as if she didn't know what to say. I couldn't believe it. She wasn't even denying it. The silence between us said more than any words could. "What's going on here, Sarah?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Is this about the art, or is it about something more? Because from where I'm standing, it sure doesn't look innocent." She finally spoke, her voice quiet and strained. "It's not like that." "Then what is it?" I demanded, stepping closer. "Tell me, because I don't understand. You've been spending all your time with him. You barely talk to me anymore, and now I walk in on this." Ethan tried to speak up again, but I turned on him, my anger boiling over. "And you," I spat. "What kind of friend are you? I trusted you. You knew Sarah was my wife, and you still did this?" He raised his hands defensively. "Look, man, I didn't mean for things to get complicated. We were just working together, and it evolved. But nothing happened, I swear." "Nothing happened?" I repeated bitterly. "You think that makes this okay?" I turned back to Sarah, my chest tightening. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you talk to me before it got this far?" She looked down at the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You've succeeded." For a long moment, none of us said anything. The air between us was thick with tension, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid crushing down on all of us. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls of the studio were closing in around me. Finally, Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." I shook my head, stepping back. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Sarah." Ethan stood there awkwardly, not knowing where to look, and I couldn't bear to be in the same room with him anymore. Without another word, I turned and left, the door slamming behind me as I stormed out into the cold night. I drove around for hours, my mind racing, my heart in pieces. Everything felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I had confronted Sarah, I had heard the truth, but it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made it worse. because now I had to face the reality of what had been broken, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. After that night, nothing was the same. I wish I could say that confronting Sarah gave me some sense of closure, but it didn't. The distance between us only deepened. There were no big fights, no dramatic arguments, just a suffocating silence that lingered between us. We avoided the hard conversations, acting like everything was still functioning when in reality, our marriage was hanging by a thread. Sarah stayed at home more, at least for the first few days after the confrontation, but I could tell she was restless, like part of her was missing when she wasn't with Ethan. I could see it in her eyes, the way she avoided mine, the way she seemed almost absent even when she was physically there. Every time her phone buzzed with a new message, she would glance at it, her face flickering with something unreadable. We barely spoke. Even when I tried, she would brush it off, saying she needed more time, that she was still figuring things out. It became clear she wasn't ready to end her connection with Ethan. Not yet. I felt trapped in a limbo where I was expected to wait for her to decide if I was enough. It was during one of these long, tense nights that I started to dig deeper into Ethan's past. I couldn't sleep, the weight of suspicion gnawing at me, so I sat down on my laptop and started searching. It wasn't hard to find information about him. He was a relatively well-known artist with several interviews and articles floating around online. I read them all, each one painting him as this creative genius with a magnetic personality. He was described as someone who brought out the best in people, especially his muses. That word again, muse. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. He had worked with several women over the years, most of them featured prominently in his work. The way these articles described his relationships with these women was strikingly familiar to what I was experiencing with Sarah. It wasn't just artistic collaboration. There was always something more intimate, more personal. Then I found it, a small piece buried in an obscure art blog. The writer mentioned that some of Ethan's previous muses had been more than just subjects. A few had been romantically involved with him, and one, in particular, had been married at the time. The article was vague, not naming names, but the implication was clear. Ethan had a history of getting too close to the women he worked with. My heart sank. This wasn't just about art. This was a pattern, and Sarah was following in the footsteps of these other women, falling under his spell, just like they had. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, my mind racing. What had started as an uneasy suspicion was turning into something far worse. A realization that Sarah was being drawn into something she didn't fully understand, or maybe she did, and that was even more terrifying. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I confronted her again. She was in the kitchen, making coffee when I walked in. I didn't waste any time. I looked into Ethan. I said, my voice tense. He's been involved with women before. Women who were more than just his muses. Sarah froze, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. She didn't look at me right away, but I could see the way her shoulders tensed, how the words hit her like a cold slap. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly, still not meeting my gaze. "Why?" I repeated, incredulous. "Because I need to understand what's going on. I need to know if you're going down the same path as all those other women. Is that what this is?" She turned around slowly, her face pale. "You don't know him like I do," she said quietly. "It's not the same. It looks pretty damn similar to me," I shot back. "He finds these women, convinces them they're special, that they're his muse, and then what? He throws them aside when the project is over." Sarah flinched, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not like that," she repeated, though her voice lacked conviction. We're not involved like that. Not yet," I said bitterly. "But you're heading there, aren't you?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might finally break, that she might confess to something. But instead, she wiped her eyes and shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what's happening anymore." The admission was like a knife in my chest. She wasn't denying it because she didn't have the strength to. She didn't know if she could stop it, if she even wanted to. "I trusted you," I said, my voice cracking. "I trusted you, and now I don't even know who you are anymore." Sarah's face crumpled, and she leaned against the counter for support. as if my words had physically hurt her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. All I could do was walk away, the walls of our home closing in on me as I retreated to the living room, my heart heavy with the weight of her unspoken betrayal. Days passed, and things only grew worse. Sarah kept going to the studio, even after everything I'd told her, after everything we'd been through. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. The excuses had stopped. She would just leave, and I would be left sitting in the silence of our crumbling marriage, knowing where she was, knowing what was happening between them, even if she couldn't admit it. The distance between us had become insurmountable, and I couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before Sarah crossed the line completely. Maybe she already had, and I just didn't know it yet. The tension in our home was unbearable. Every day that Sarah left for Ethan's studio, I felt like I was losing her a little more. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained, like we were trying to avoid saying what we both knew was happening. She'd stopped making excuses or even trying to explain herself. There was a quiet resignation in the way she left the house each time, like she was too far gone to turn back. One night, after Sarah had left yet again, I made a decision. I had to know the truth. No more guessing, no more half answers. I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I needed to see for myself what was really going on between her and Ethan. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I knew it was the only way. I waited until Sarah had been gone for a few hours before grabbing my coat and heading out to Ethan's studio. I'd been there before, enough times to know the building's layout, the back entrance, and the way the windows faced the alley. The idea of sneaking around felt wrong, but I didn't care anymore. All that mattered was finding out the truth. When I arrived, the street was quiet, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. I parked a few blocks away and approached the building on foot, careful to keep out of sight. The back of the studio faced a narrow alley, and as I made my way toward it, I spotted the faint light seeping through the curtains. My heart raced in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I crept closer. There was a large window at the back of the studio, partially covered by a thin curtain. I crouched low, my breath catching in my throat as I peered inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. Ethan was painting, standing in front of an easel, his brush moving in slow, deliberate strokes. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was Sarah, sitting on a stool in the center of the room, completely nude. Her body was illuminated by the soft light of the studio, her form both vulnerable and beautiful in a way that felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. She wasn't just posing for a painting. She was bearing herself in a way she hadn't with me in years. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. It was intimate, far more intimate than any words or actions she could have told me. The way Ethan looked at her, the way his eyes lingered on every curve of her body, made my blood boil. But what hurt the most was how comfortable she seemed, how at ease she was in his presence, as if this was where she belonged. I wanted to storm in, to demand answers, to drag her out of there, but something held me back. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was fear of what I'd do if I confronted them right then and there. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, watching in stunned silence as Ethan continued to paint, and Sarah sat there, completely unaware of my presence. I couldn't tell how much time passed, minutes, maybe hours, before Sarah stood up. Ethan stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth, and they exchanged words I couldn't hear through the glass. Then, to my utter devastation, he reached out and touched her. It was subtle, his hand resting on her bare shoulder, but it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. She didn't pull away. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode in my chest. I stumbled down the alley, the cold air stinging my face as I fought back the tears burning in my eyes. How could she do this? How could she betray everything we'd built, everything we'd been through? By the time I got back to my car, I was shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no sense to be made. Sarah had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When I finally drove home, I felt numb. The anger had been replaced by a hollow emptiness, a realization that everything I'd feared had come true. There was no going back from this. Sarah wasn't just drifting away from me anymore. She was already gone. She came home late, as usual, and found me sitting in the dark living room, just like so many nights before. But this time, I wasn't waiting to talk. I wasn't waiting for explanations. I was waiting for the truth. When she walked in, she seemed surprised to see me still awake. "You're up," she said, her voice soft, like she wasn't sure what to expect. I looked at her, my eyes scanning her face for any sign of guilt, of remorse. But all I saw was the same exhaustion, the same distance that had been there for weeks. "I know," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Sarah froze, her eyes widening. "What do you mean?" "I know what's been going on with you and Ethan," I replied, standing up slowly. "I saw you tonight, at the studio." Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks as the weight of my words hit her. For a moment, she didn't say anything, her mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to find the right thing to say. "It's not," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I was there. I saw everything." The room was silent, the tension between us thick and unbearable. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, but I didn't feel sympathy anymore. All I felt was the crushing weight of betrayal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I shook my head, my heart breaking all over again. "Sorry doesn't change what you did." She wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "I never meant for this to happen." "Then why did it?" I asked, my voice cracking with the weight of the question. "Why did you let it get this far?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. We both knew there was nothing she could say that would make this better. Nothing that would undo the damage that had already been done. The silence that followed my question was suffocating. Sarah stood there, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She didn't even try to offer an explanation. And that silence felt like the final confirmation I didn't want but knew deep down. She had chosen Ethan. The distance between us hadn't just grown, it had broken us entirely. "Why didn't you stop?" I asked, my voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "If you didn't mean for it to happen, why didn't you stop?" Her lip quivered as she wiped at her eyes, trying to pull herself together. "I don't know," she whispered. I got lost in it. It wasn't supposed to mean anything." My chest tightened. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything?" I repeated bitterly. "So all those nights, all those hours spent at his studio, posing for him, letting him touch you, that didn't mean anything to you?" Sarah winced at my words, but she didn't deny it. "It was about the art," she tried to say, but the words fell flat, empty. I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. "Don't give me that. Don't try to hide behind the excuse of art. This wasn't just about painting or sketching, and you know it." She looked down at the floor, guilt written all over her face. The woman I had loved for years, the woman I had built a life with, was standing in front of me, and yet she felt like a stranger. The hurt was unbearable, but what made it worse was the way she couldn't or wouldn't fight for us. There was no defense, no desperate plea to save what we had. Just quiet resignation. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the cold, quiet room. "But you did," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "You hurt me more than I thought was possible." She looked up at me then, her eyes red and filled with tears. "I know," she whispered. "I know I've ruined everything." For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of our heavy breathing, both of us standing on opposite sides of a chasm that felt impossible to bridge. I couldn't bring myself to say anything more. The truth of her betrayal hung between us, too heavy to lift. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft and trembling. I think I should leave." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't stop her. Part of me had been waiting for this, waiting for her to admit that she was done, that we were done. I stared at her for a long moment, and though I wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, I couldn't. The woman I wanted to fight for wasn't standing in front of me anymore. She had already left, long before this moment. "Maybe you should," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her tears spilling over once again. She moved to the bedroom, gathering a few things in a bag without a word. I stood there, frozen in place. As she moved around the house we had once shared, the life we had built together falling apart with every item she packed. When she was done, she walked toward the front door, hesitating for a moment as if waiting for me to say something. I couldn't. I was too exhausted, too broken to even try. "I'm sorry," she whispered one last time before walking out the door and closing it softly behind her. And just like that, she was gone. I stood in the empty house, the weight of the silence crushing me. It felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I walked over to the couch and sank into it, my head in my hands, trying to process what had just happened. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built my life with, had walked out, and there was nothing I could do to change it. For hours, I sat there, replaying the events in my mind. How we had ended up here, the slow unraveling of our marriage, and how blind I had been to the warning signs. Every moment felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. The way she had looked at Ethan, the way she had become so distant, so disconnected from me, it all made sense now. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the numbness set in. It was a strange kind of relief to feel nothing after so much pain. But even in the numbness, there was a deep sadness, a hollow ache that I knew wouldn't go away anytime soon. In the days that followed, Sarah didn't come back. She sent a few texts asking about picking up the rest of her things, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't face her. I couldn't face what we had lost. I started to hear whispers from mutual friends, people who knew what had happened, but I didn't care to explain. The details didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that the life I thought I knew, the woman I thought I loved, were both gone. As time passed, I realized that the betrayal wasn't just about the affair with Ethan. It was about everything. The way she had chosen him over me, the way she had let our marriage fall apart without trying to save it. I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken, devastated by the realization that the person I thought I could trust most in the world had torn my life apart. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I couldn't bring myself to lie in the bed we had once shared, not after everything that had happened. Instead, I slept on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to find some semblance of peace in the chaos of my emotions. But peace didn't come. Not yet. In the weeks that followed Sarah's departure, the house felt more like a tomb than a home. Every room was a reminder of what we had lost. Her absence was a constant presence, lingering in the air, haunting me with memories of better times. I couldn't escape the weight of it. Her betrayal, the finality of it all. Each day felt like I was moving through thick fog, my mind clouded by anger, sadness, and the endless questions that had no answers. I avoided everyone, friends, family, even co-workers. The thought of explaining what had happened was unbearable. What would I say? That my wife left me for an artist, seduced by the thrill of being someone's muse? That I had stood by, helpless, while she drifted further and further away until she finally walked out of our life? It was humiliating. I felt like I had failed, not just as a husband, but as a person. The house had become a prison, full of things that no longer had any meaning. Her clothes were still in the closet, her books on the shelves, our wedding photos hanging on the walls. I couldn't bring myself to pack them up. Every time I tried, it felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that she was really gone. And then there was Ethan. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about how he had wormed his way into our lives, into my wife's heart. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that hurt. It was the way he had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. He had turned Sarah into someone I no longer recognized, someone who had chosen him over the life we had built together. The thought of it made my blood boil. I couldn't let him get away with it. I couldn't just sit there and watch him live his life as if nothing had happened. It was late one night, after too many drinks and too many sleepless hours, that the idea of revenge started to take shape in my mind. I knew I couldn't confront Sarah directly anymore. There was nothing left to say between us. But Ethan was a different story. He was the one who had lured her away, the one who had encouraged her to cross lines she never should have crossed. He needed to pay for what he had done. I started digging deeper into Ethan's life. I wanted to know everything about him, his past, his relationships, his career. It wasn't hard to find. His reputation as a rising star in the art world meant there were articles and interviews, plenty of material to sift through. But as I read more, I started to see a pattern, one that made my blood run cold. Ethan's muses weren't just subjects for his paintings. They were women he had seduced, used, and discarded once their time in his spotlight was over. There were whispers, vague mentions of affairs with married women, broken relationships left in his wake. I found a few comments from people in the art community who hinted at his reputation, though none of it was ever openly discussed. Ethan was good at keeping up appearances, at protecting his image. But I knew what he really was, a predator who used his art to manipulate and control the women he worked with. Sarah wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. It wasn't just about what had happened between him and Sarah. It was about all the other women, the other lives he had destroyed in the name of art. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I started contacting some of the women who had been involved with Ethan, reaching out quietly, under the radar. Some of them were reluctant to talk at first, wary of dredging up old wounds, but a few were willing to open up. They told me stories of how Ethan had charmed them, how he had made them feel special, like they were part of something greater than themselves. But once the painting was done, once their role in his art was complete, he had discarded them without a second thought, moving on to the next muse, the next conquest. The more I learned, the clearer my plan became. I wasn't just going to confront Ethan. I was going to destroy him. I wanted him to feel what I had felt. I wanted to take away everything that mattered to him, to tear down the image he had so carefully built. And I knew exactly how to do it. Ethan's weakness was his ego, his desperate need for validation and admiration. He thrived on the praise of the art world, on the adoration of his followers. Without that, he was nothing. And I was going to make sure that the world saw him for what he truly was, a fraud, a manipulator, someone who used women for his own selfish purposes and left them broken in his wake. I started documenting everything, his affairs, his manipulations, the stories from the women he had hurt. I gathered evidence, piecing together the real picture of who Ethan was. And then I set the wheels in motion. It started with whispers. Rumors spread quietly through the art community. Anonymous tips sent to galleries, collectors, and journalists who were already curious about Ethan's rise to fame. At first, it was just small murmurs, questions about his ethics, his relationships with his muses. But as more and more people started to talk, the whispers grew louder. I could see it unfolding in real time, the slow unraveling of his reputation. Then came the public accusations. One of the women I had spoken to, a former muse who had been deeply hurt by Ethan, agreed to come forward. She told her story to a well-known art journalist, and the article that followed was damning. It exposed Ethan's pattern of behavior, the way he used and discarded women under the guise of creativity. And once her story was out, others began to speak up as well. More women came forward, confirming what I had already known, that Ethan wasn't the genius the art world thought he was. He was a predator, and his career had been built on the backs of the women he had exploited. The fallout was swift. Galleries pulled his work from their walls. Collectors distanced themselves. Journalists who had once praised him now condemned him. His carefully constructed image was shattered, and there was no going back. I watched it all unfold with a grim sense of satisfaction. I had taken from him what he had taken from me, everything. He would never hurt another woman the way he had hurt Sarah, the way he had hurt me. But even as Ethan's life crumbled, I couldn't escape the emptiness that lingered inside me. I had won, in a way, but the victory felt hollow. I had destroyed him, but I couldn't undo what had been done. I couldn't bring back the life I had lost. And Sarah, she was still gone. Watching Ethan's life unravel was supposed to give me satisfaction, a sense of closure. I had orchestrated every part of his downfall, and the art world was now seeing him for the fraud he truly was. But as the days passed, the hollow victory weighed on me, gnawing at the edges of my soul. There was no undoing the damage to my marriage, to my heart. Sarah was still gone, and with her, the life I thought I had built. Even though I had succeeded in ruining Ethan's reputation, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The scars of what he had done to me, what he had taken from me, ran too deep. He hadn't just stolen my wife. He had dismantled the foundation of trust and love I had believed in. The humiliation, the betrayal, it lingered like a wound that refused to heal. One night, as I sat alone in the house that now felt like a shell of its former self, I realized something. I hadn't just been waiting for closure. I had been waiting for Ethan to feel the same depth of pain I was living with. I wanted him to experience the kind of personal loss that couldn't be measured by ruined careers or bad press. I wanted him to lose something that mattered to him the way I had lost Sarah. The plan that had been taking shape in the back of my mind for weeks now solidified. Ethan's ego was his Achilles heel, but there was another vulnerability he hadn't guarded well enough: his circle of friends and supporters. He surrounded himself with people who fed his narcissism, including the women he hadn't yet burned. And there was one person who mattered more than anyone else to him: Lauren. Lauren was his longtime partner. Though they weren't officially together, they had been inseparable in the art community for years. She was younger, beautiful, and fiercely loyal to him, defending him against critics and always standing by his side at gallery openings and parties. She had been a part of his success as much as anyone. From what I had gathered, she believed in him, saw him as a tortured artist misunderstood by the world. But she had no idea of the full extent of his manipulations, of the trail of women he had left behind in his rise to fame. I wasn't proud of what I was planning to do, but I had gone too far down this path to turn back now. If I couldn't get Sarah back, if I couldn't undo the damage, I would make sure Ethan felt the same depth of loss I was living with. I knew Lauren would be the key. I started reaching out to people in Ethan's orbit, gathering information. Through mutual connections, I found out that Lauren was planning to host a private gallery showing for Ethan in a few weeks, an attempt to salvage what was left of his career. The gallery was small but prestigious, the kind of place where Ethan's past supporters would come out to defend him despite the allegations. That was where I would make my move. I spent days preparing, crafting a plan that would ensure Ethan's public humiliation went even deeper. I knew that exposing him in front of his most loyal supporters would be the final blow, but I needed more than just gossip or whispers this time. I needed concrete proof, something that even Lauren couldn't ignore. It was easier than I expected to find what I was looking for. Through my contacts, I managed to track down a woman who had once been close to Ethan, a former muse who had quietly left the art scene after their relationship had ended. She had stayed out of the public eye, but when I reached out to her, she was willing to talk. Her story was the final piece I needed. She shared with me the details of her time with Ethan, how he had promised her everything, how he had manipulated her emotions, used her, and then discarded her when he found someone new. But it wasn't just her story that mattered. It was the evidence she had kept: photos, messages, intimate details that painted a picture of Ethan as the predator he truly was. With her permission, I collected everything. The night of the gallery showing arrived, and I was ready. I dressed for the occasion, blending in with the crowd of art enthusiasts and critics who had come to see Ethan's work. The gallery was buzzing with anticipation, people murmuring about whether Ethan would be able to bounce back from the recent scandals. Lauren was there, of course, standing by Ethan's side, smiling and holding his hand as if nothing had changed. They moved through the crowd, greeting supporters, putting on the facade of a united front. But I knew it wouldn't last. I'd already made sure of that. As the evening wore on, I positioned myself near the center of the gallery, waiting for the right moment. Ethan was in the middle of giving a speech about his creative process when I made my move. I pulled out my phone and sent the package of evidence to several key figures in the room: journalists, collectors, and most importantly, Lauren herself. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. I watched from across the room as Lauren's phone buzzed. She glanced at it casually at first, but as she read through the messages, her expression changed. Her smile faltered, and her face went pale. She turned to Ethan, who was still talking, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. Lauren's hands began to shake as she scrolled through the photos, the messages, the undeniable proof of Ethan's infidelities and manipulations. I could see the realization dawning on her, the horror in her eyes as she understood that the man she had devoted herself to was nothing like the person she thought she knew. The room grew quieter as more people received the same package, their eyes darting between their phones and Ethan. Murmurs of confusion and disgust rippled through the crowd, and soon enough, the gallery was buzzing with conversation. Ethan, sensing that something was wrong, stopped mid-sentence, looking around in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice faltering. Lauren stepped forward, holding up her phone, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "What is this, Ethan?" she demanded, loud enough for everyone to hear. He looked at her, his face paling as he realized what she was holding. "Lauren, I can explain." But she wasn't listening. "Is this what you've been doing? Is this how you treat people? Is this how you treated me?" The room fell into stunned silence as Lauren's voice rang out, echoing off the gallery walls. Ethan tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The crowd was watching, waiting, their judgment already sealed. Ethan stammered, his usual charm and confidence slipping away as he fumbled for an explanation, but none came. Lauren threw the phone at his feet and stormed out, her face twisted with betrayal. The people around Ethan began to whisper more loudly, some shaking their heads in disgust, others taking out their phones to read the same damning evidence. Ethan stood there alone, his life crumbling around him, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. It was over. I left the gallery that night with a strange sense of calm. I had gotten my revenge. Ethan's life was in ruins, just like mine had been. But as I walked away from the scene of his destruction, I couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. Could anything ever be enough to fill the void that Sarah had left behind? In the weeks after the gallery debacle, Ethan's world continued to spiral downward. The public humiliation, the backlash from the art community, and the fallout with Lauren left him in complete isolation. It wasn't long before his work was pulled from nearly every gallery that had once praised him. Collectors stopped returning his calls, and the people who had once fawned over his talent now wanted nothing to do with him. He had become a pariah. Part of me felt vindicated. Ethan had taken everything from me, and now I had taken everything from him. He had been stripped of the things that mattered most to him: his reputation, his career, and even the woman who had stood by his side. It was exactly what I had planned, and yet the satisfaction I thought I'd feel was fleeting. The hollow ache inside me hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had deepened. Sarah's absence hung over me like a dark cloud, one I couldn't escape no matter how much I tried. She hadn't contacted me since that night she left, and I had made no attempt to reach out to her. I didn't know where she was or what she was doing, and a part of me didn't want to know. The pain of losing her was too raw, too fresh. But despite everything, I wasn't done with Ethan. Watching his public downfall had been one thing, but I wanted him to understand the personal cost of what he'd done, to feel the kind of loss that went beyond career and reputation. I wanted him to experience the same gut-wrenching betrayal that I had endured. And to do that, I needed to push a little further. It wasn't enough that Lauren had left him. She had stormed out of the gallery that night, but I knew her well enough to understand that her connection to Ethan wasn't severed so easily. From what I'd gathered, she had cut off all communication with him, but she hadn't made any public statements, hadn't denounced him as many others had. A part of me wondered if she was struggling with the same emotions I had been when Sarah first started slipping away, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something left to salvage. That was where I would strike next. Through the contacts I had used before, I reached out to a few people in Lauren's orbit. Quietly, carefully, I planted seeds of doubt, rumors about Ethan's past that hadn't yet come to light. I knew Lauren still had feelings for him, and I intended to use those feelings against her. It was cruel, perhaps, but I had already crossed that line long ago. There was no turning back now. I arranged for an anonymous tip to reach Lauren, a message that suggested Ethan hadn't just betrayed her with other women, but that his manipulations went far deeper than she could have imagined. I made sure she received documents, photos, things that would make her question everything she thought she knew about him. My goal wasn't just to push her away. It was to make sure she would never trust him again. A few days later, I heard from one of my contacts that Lauren had confronted Ethan at his apartment. From what I gathered, the confrontation had been explosive. She had demanded answers, accused him of lying to her for years, of manipulating her feelings for his own gain. Ethan, in typical fashion, had tried to charm his way out of it, but Lauren wasn't having it. She had stormed out for the last time, and this time, there was no going back. Ethan was alone now, completely and utterly alone. I should have felt triumphant. I had destroyed his career, his reputation, and now his last remaining relationship. But as I sat in my empty house, staring at the remnants of the life I had once shared with Sarah, I realized something that shook me to my core. Revenge hadn't healed me. It hadn't filled the void left by Sarah's betrayal. If anything, it had deepened the darkness that had taken hold of me. I had spent so much time focused on ruining Ethan's life, on making him feel the same pain I had felt, that I hadn't stopped to consider the cost of it all. In my quest for vengeance, I had lost myself. The night after I learned about Ethan and Lauren's final fight, I found myself sitting in the same dark living room where Sarah had once stood, telling me she didn't know what she wanted anymore. I replayed those moments in my head, over and over, trying to understand how we had gotten here, how our marriage had crumbled, how everything we had built had fallen apart so easily. And then it hit me. The truth wasn't that Sarah had chosen Ethan over me. The truth was that I had already lost her long before Ethan came into the picture. I had been so focused on providing for us, on building a life, that I hadn't noticed when we stopped connecting, when we stopped seeing each other. Ethan had been the catalyst, but the cracks had been there for years. I realized then that no amount of revenge could fix what had been broken. I could destroy Ethan's life, but it wouldn't bring Sarah back. It wouldn't undo the distance that had grown between us or the choices she had made. And it certainly wouldn't heal the wound that had been festering inside me since the day I discovered her affair. I had been so consumed by my need for vengeance that I had lost sight of the real issue, the pain of losing someone I loved. And now, even after Ethan's downfall, that pain was still there, as raw and as real as ever. That night I made a decision. It wasn't an easy one, and it didn't come with any sense of closure or peace. But it was the only decision I had left. I couldn't keep living in the past, reliving the betrayal over and over again. I couldn't keep fueling my anger and hatred, hoping it would somehow make things right. I needed to let go. The next morning, I gathered what little strength I had left and started the process of moving on. I packed up Sarah's things, placing them in boxes and setting them aside for her to collect. I deleted the messages, the photos, everything I had saved from my months of digging into Ethan's life. It was time to let go of the obsession, to stop feeding the darkness inside me. For the first time in months, I reached out to Sarah, not to beg for her to come back, but to ask for closure. I didn't know if she would respond, or if she even wanted to talk to me anymore, but I knew that I couldn't move forward without at least trying to understand how we had ended up here. She agreed to meet. When we sat down across from each other in a quiet cafe, the distance between us felt vast, but there was no anger anymore, just a deep sadness. We talked, really talked for the first time since the night she left. She explained how lost she had felt, how disconnected she had become. I told her how hurt I had been, how I had tried to fix everything by focusing on revenge. We both cried. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no promises to get back together. But for the first time, I felt like we were both being honest with each other, acknowledging the pain we had caused and the mistakes we had made. When we parted ways, I didn't feel whole, but I felt lighter. I had spent so long clinging to the past, to the anger and the betrayal, that I hadn't realized how much it was holding me down. Letting go didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the scars, but it was the first step toward healing. And maybe, someday, that would be enough. The weeks after my final conversation with Sarah were a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. I had let go of the need for revenge, had released the anger that had consumed me for so long, but I was still grappling with the emptiness that remained. Healing wasn't a linear path, and the wounds left by her betrayal and my obsession with Ethan were still fresh. I spent a lot of time alone, reflecting on the choices I had made, both before and after I learned the truth. But one thing had changed. I had stopped looking back with anger. For the first time in a long while, I started thinking about the future, not about revenge, not about what had been taken from me, but about what I could rebuild for myself. It was a small shift, but it was enough to pull me out of the darkest part of the storm. Ethan, however, hadn't been able to recover from the fallout I had engineered. The rumors about him had spread like wildfire, and the revelations from the women he had manipulated continued to surface. His career, once the subject of glowing praise, was now a shadow of its former self. Galleries refused to show his work, patrons had abandoned him, and Lauren's public denouncement had cemented his downfall. In some ways, I pitied him. I had wanted him to feel the same kind of devastation that I had, but seeing him reduced to a broken shell didn't bring me any joy. It only reminded me of how much damage revenge could do, to both the victim and the one seeking it. Then came the day of the final gallery showing. It was an event that no one had expected. Despite the scandals, despite the destruction of his reputation, Ethan had managed to secure one last exhibition. It wasn't at a prestigious gallery, and it wasn't backed by the influential art world elite. Instead, it was a small, almost forgotten space on the outskirts of the city, one of the only places left that hadn't completely turned its back on him. When I heard about the event, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go. I had already orchestrated his downfall. I had no reason to see the aftermath up close. But a part of me, the part that had once been his friend, was curious. What was Ethan like now? How had he changed since everything fell apart? Would there be any remnants of the man I had once known, or had my actions destroyed him completely? Against my better judgment, I decided to attend. The gallery was small, dimly lit, and almost empty when I arrived. A few stragglers wandered the room, mostly older patrons who didn't seem to be part of the art world's elite. The air felt heavy with a sense of finality, like this was the last breath of Ethan's career. I walked in quietly, keeping to the edges of the room, observing the few pieces on display. They were familiar, portraits and sketches, all in Ethan's signature style, but they lacked the vibrancy I had once admired in his work. It was as if the spark that had once driven him had been extinguished. Then I saw him. Ethan stood near the back of the room, talking to an older couple who seemed more interested in the free wine than the art on the walls. He looked different, thinner, his face drawn and pale, with dark circles under his eyes. His once confident posture had sagged, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He spotted me as I walked in, and for a moment I thought he would look away, avoid me like so many others had since his fall from grace. But instead, he excused himself from the couple and walked toward me. "Didn't think you'd show up," he said quietly when he reached me, his voice lacking the charm it had once carried. I shrugged, unsure of what to say. I wasn't sure either. Ethan nodded, glancing around the nearly empty gallery. "It's not much, is it?" he said with a bitter smile. I didn't respond. What could I say? This wasn't the triumphant artist who had once stood in packed galleries, surrounded by admirers. This was a man who had lost everything: his career, his relationships, his reputation, all because of the choices he had made. And because of the choices I had made. He let out a long sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "You got what you wanted, didn't you?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I knew what he was asking. Did I feel victorious? Did I feel satisfied, knowing that I had taken everything from him? I met his gaze, my voice steady. "No," I admitted. "Not really." Ethan looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "Yeah, funny how that works, huh?" There was no malice in his voice, no anger or bitterness, just exhaustion. He was as tired of this as I was. We stood there in silence for a few minutes, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. I thought back to the days when we had been friends, before Sarah, before the betrayal, before everything had fallen apart. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to blame him for everything that had happened. It wasn't that I forgave him. What he had done with Sarah was unforgivable. But I no longer felt the same burning anger that had driven me for so long. Ethan broke the silence first. "She left, you know," he said, his voice low. "Lauren, she's gone. Won't talk to me. Won't even look at me." I nodded, not surprised. I had been the one to push her away. After all, "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Ethan glanced at me, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. "No, you're not." "Maybe not," I said quietly. but I didn't think it would go this far. He shook his head. Yeah, well, neither did I. For a moment, we were just two broken men standing in the middle of a failing gallery, surrounded by the remnants of lives we had both destroyed. His through manipulation, mine through revenge. I think I'm done, Ethan said finally, looking around the room with a sigh. No more shows, no more paintings. It's over. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Ethan had lost everything, and for the first time, I realized that I had lost more than I could have ever imagined too. We didn't speak again after that. I left the gallery without saying goodbye, walking out into the cold night with the strange sense that this chapter of my life had finally come to an end. As I made my way home, I thought about Sarah, about how we had ended up here, and how there had been no winners in the end. Not me, not her, not Ethan. We had all lost something: trust, love, a sense of who we were, and nothing could bring those things back. But as the cool air cleared my mind, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally ready to move on, ready to start rebuilding the life I had lost. Not through revenge, but through forgiveness, not of Ethan, but of myself. I had allowed the darkness of betrayal and anger to consume me for too long. It was time to let go, to heal, and to find peace in whatever came next. The end was finally here, but in that ending, there was the hope of a new beginning. Thank you for joining us for this touching journey of love, betrayal, and redemption. We hope it resonated with you, even brought a little inspiration. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions in the comments. Feel free to share your own experiences or let us know what kinds of stories you'd like to see next. Thanks again for your support. Until then, take care and stay tuned for more great content.